Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Louis Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Xiujing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. It's any meeting between Daoists because it's always about the Tao in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and more open discussion. For this second set of talks, I want to discuss some more technical topics, especially relevant for members of the Daoist Foundation and the larger global Daoist community, whether from an adherent or scholarly perspective. So I'm going to share my screen with you. For this Lundao, I want to focus on new Daoist studies, specifically our emerging model and community rooted in a Daoist study practice approach. So moving towards the possibility of what we refer to as new Daoist studies. I apologize for the high degree of self-reference in this slide. However, this is the actual history. So Daoist studies is conventionally understood as the academic field dedicated to research and education on Daoism. But now it's also an emerging scholarly community outside of mainstream academia, including independent researchers. So this is how I'm now located, having left mainstream academia in 2019. It's Daoist studies in which the Daoist is primary. It's Daoist informed and perhaps even Daoist inspired and Daoist infused. It may employ a scholar-practitioner approach and critical adherent discourse. So it doesn't necessarily need to employ this. It could simply be Daoist informed. There could be a stronger emphasis on really understanding Daoism as Daoism rather than as a means to kind of advance like academic careerism, which is how it tends to be kind of framed now as an academic field, that is conventional sinological views. Well, here, what I want to suggest is that there's this possibility of a new model, a different kind of model, one in which a scholar-practitioner approach is not only viable, but makes certain kinds of contributions. So this isn't to deny the contributions of kind of conventional sinological approaches. It's to say that there are other possibilities. There are certain kinds of limitations of those received approaches that maybe a scholar-practitioner approach can add something to. So this is study informed by practice, practice informed by study. There's this emphasis on being rooted in the tradition. So I think of myself, obviously, as a Daoist scholar-practitioner and explicitly trying to articulate and apply and express this kind of approach. Critical adherent discourse is specifically a kind of form of critically aware subjectivity. So of course, here we're talking about Daoist adherence. So the possibility that Daoists can also be scholars of the Daoist tradition, which might seem strange to have to say, but most of the time Daoists are excluded from mainstream Daoist studies and mainstream kind of Daoist studies accounts of the tradition. So there's this possibility of Daoists making unique contributions to a kind of scholarly understanding of the tradition and also kind of educational presentations of what Daoism is. This new Daoist studies was first envisioned in my Cultivating Perfection, which was published by Brill in 2007 and advanced through the Daoist Studies unit of the American Academy of Religion, which I founded in 2004. It still exists, although it's largely become kind of conventional sinological approaches to Taoism. But there are a number of things that come up here. So one thing is Cultivating Perfection was the first book to explicitly advance a religious studies approach, so a comparative and cross-cultural approach that's informed by theoretical and methodological issues related to the academic study of religion. The Daoist Studies unit in the American Academy of Religion was intentionally founded to kind of suggest a broadening of this field to include other kinds of theoretical and methodological approaches. It was New Daoist Studies, that is, was explicitly envisioned and discussed on the panel New Directions in Daoist Studies at the 2017 AAR annual meeting, which I organized and focused on my Taming the Wild Horse, James Miller's China's Green Religion, and David Palmer and Elijah Siegler's Dream Trippers. So these are books that begin to articulate what we can talk about as an explicitly new Daoist studies. That is, one that's not simply a kind of conventional sinological approach to Taoism. Taoism as a kind of historical artifact, Taoism as solely about like kind of mainland Chinese Taoism. So in Taming the Wild Horse, this is a scholarly study and translation of a slightly later Trenjen Complete Perfection Illustrated Meditation Manual. It's the first book to fuse animal studies, contemplative studies, Daoist studies, and religious studies. James Miller's China's Green Religion focuses on questions of Taoism and ecology, especially as being articulated and explored in contemporary China. And then David Palmer and Elijah Siegler's Dream Trippers is about global Taoism, including the global transformation of Taoism, but what's happening in mainland Chinese Taoism, especially Taoist monasteries associated with the Trenjen Complete Perfection Order, and then the larger kind of global engagement and application modification of Taoism. And I'm involved in that process in the book. So I'm part of that book's kind of narrative, for better or worse. So when we look at this, these actually supply models for new Daoist studies. That is, thinking about larger questions, larger themes, larger issues that can inform Taoism and that Taoism might provide certain kinds of insights related to. So this isn't to make Taoism into a resource for those other kinds of questions. It's to say there are different ways of studying and understanding Taoism than solely as a kind of Chinese religion, traditional Chinese religion rooted in traditional Chinese culture, or even a historical artifact reconstructed through textual analysis. New Daoist Studies was more fully articulated and explicitly articulated in my recent primer for translating Taoist literature, published last year through Purple Cloud Press. As the title suggests, this book has an intention of helping people develop a greater facility to engage Taoism in a bilingual manner, but also to translate Taoist literature. And now being advanced through the Center for Daoist Studies, especially what we refer to as the CDS approach or the CDSA, and through the Daoist Translation Committee, which I'm the editor-in-chief of, that was established in last year in 2022. So one thing here to point out is that the Primer for Translating Daoist Literature makes an explicit argument for what we're talking about here as new Daoist studies, including the possibility of Daoist translation. So that is, Daoists trying to translate Daoist literature in an accurate way that's attentive to Daoist technical terminology understood from a Daoist perspective, and maybe even to create new forms of Daoist literature in other languages. So that means, like, rather than solely thinking about it as the Chinese source text, approximating the Chinese source text into new translations, into new textual materials that might be thought of as Daoist literature in other languages. It's also connected to the Daoist Translation Seminar. So this was established in 2021, and then it's an ongoing Daoist Studies Summer Seminar through the Daoist Foundation. And this Daoist Translation Seminar was really trying to help people think through the possibility of being a Daoist, reading Daoist literature, translating Daoist literature, understanding Daoist literature from a Daoist perspective in terms of attentiveness to Daoist technical terminology. And this was what fed into the Primer for Translating Daoist Literature. So a kind of quasi-textbook for those kinds of undertakings. To this, CF means compare, so we can compare what we might call old Daoist studies, aka conventional sinological approaches, which are really contemporary 19th century Orientalist accounts, via the Strickmannians, or also the Bogenkamp Cabal, and also unaffectionately referred to as the Sinological Mafia. So this is named after the American Francophile sinologist Michel Strickmann, born Michael Strickman. He lived from 1942 to 1994. And what I refer to as the Strickmannian or the truncated view of Taoism is that Taoism begins in the later Han Dynasty with the Tianshi, with the Celestial Masters movement. And this is really from a Strickmannian view, Strickmannian interpretation, the beginning of Taoism. So those of you who know my work, including some of these Lundao, know that I think that Taoism actually started in the late Warring States period and the early Han Dynasty, what we refer to as the intercultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So that's why this is also referred to as the truncated view. It basically splits Taoist history and neglects a really important kind of pivotal original moment in Taoist history. This is the dominant sinological, I would say, misinterpretation of Taoist history. If you look at it historically, it really comes out of contemporary Taiwanese Zhengyi Orthodox unity views of the tradition, and then that starts to influence the sinological account of it. In fact, when we also look at it historically, Strickmann did not intend this to become the dominant model. He meant it to be a revisionist view. He meant it to be a corrective of the received Legian or bifurcated view. That is the distinction between so-called philosophical Taoism strike through and so-called religious Taoism strike through. But unfortunately, it's become almost like canonical in mainstream sinological views or approaches to Daoist studies. So a failure to kind of consider Taoism before the later Han Dynasty, including connections between classical Taoism and what we refer to as early organized Taoism. Sometimes I talk about this as Taoism between Taoism. That is the way in which maybe the intercultivation lineages flow into Fang Shi formula master lineages, and then those also feed into early organized Taoism, but that's a story for another day. So those of you who are interested in this can look at my book, The Daoist Tradition, where I have an explicit critique of both the dominant received framework, that is the Legian view, and also the primary revisionist view, which is the Strickmannian view, moving into what we talk about as the continuity of tradition or lineal view, which is what we're talking about here as part of new Daoist studies. So that Taoism really begins with the intercultivation lineages of classical Taoism in the late Warring States period and early Western Han Dynasty. So that continuity of tradition and lineal view was explicitly articulated in the Daoist Tradition book that was published in 2013. I'm currently have a proposal in to revise the book, but now we increasingly refer to it as the Center for Daoist Studies approach, so the CDSA. We can talk about also the fact that New Daoist Studies has been co-opted in the Namesake series, which was established in 2019, and you can see the dates. The dates are important because you can see these other influences on this through the University of Hawaii Press that was indebted without acknowledgement to these above developments. It's actually old Daoist studies conducted by younger Strickmannians. So the question of what new Daoist studies actually is comes up here. New Daoist studies is what I'm articulating here and what comes out of these various earlier kind of events and expression publications. So again, the co-optation of it, that is the presentation of old Daoist studies as new Daoist studies, also distorts these other possibilities. And another dimension of this is the fact that the Daoist Studies unit is in the American Academy of Religion. So technically what that means is that it's not sinology, it's religious studies. So how is it informed by religious studies? Is it actually located in religious studies? And one thing that comes up here is that most of the appointments in religious studies for sinological scholars of Taoism, they have no training in religious studies. So why are they in religious studies departments? Why are those appointments being kind of filled by people who don't have formal training in religious studies or don't actually use a religious studies approach? So that's another kind of complicated historical development related to the history of academia. But to kind of conclude this, I'll also say that drawing upon Friedrich Nietzsche and Walter Benjamin, usually history is a victor's narrative. So the people who win write the history, which means that hypothetically, the kind of sinological, the dominant sinological approach and representatives of Daoist studies would potentially write the history. And so they can say new Daoist studies is this, even though it's actually old Daoist studies. So in this presentation, I'm rewriting that history. In this context, history is not a victor's narrative. There's a subversive alternative stream, a counterculture, if you will, a resistance movement. So thinking about framing metaphors for understanding Taoism, new Daoist studies sees Taoism as a sacred site, old Daoist studies sees it as a museum, new Daoist studies understands it as an old growth forest, old Daoist studies as a strip mall, new Daoist studies as a wild animal, old Daoist studies as a taxidermy trophy, new Daoist studies as an intact culture, and old Daoist studies as an artifact. So here we can also say, from my perspective, rooted in a scholar-practitioner perspective, that new Daoist studies, at least ideally, has some kind of reverential engagement with Taoism as a living and lived tradition, including as a global religious tradition, with this diversity of expression, involvement, participation, and so on. Old Daoist studies is really about careerist advancement. It's really about playing the game of academia, and a lot of it is conformist. There's a lot of attempts to kind of position oneself in terms of power and influence that has very little to do with Taoism, that is understanding Taoism, and even less to do with Taoist values and Taoist commitments. So is it really Daoist studies? That would be one of the questions that comes up. So thinking about new Daoist studies and what I'm referring to as Daoist translation, it's rooted in an interest in Taoism as such, including tradition-based Daoist practice realization from a applied, committed, and lived perspective. So it breaks certain academic taboos. It challenges like looking at Taoism solely as an object of study, but that there's a participatory element that's possible that might actually add a deeper understanding of the Daoist tradition. It uses a study practice model, so study informing practice and practice informing study. Scripture study, Jingxue, as one dimension of holistic and integrated Daoist practice. So not just reading and translating text in order to generate scholarship, but actually thinking about this as a primary Daoist practice, like a deeper engagement with important Daoist scriptures, sacred text, Jing, and the way in which they inform Daoist practice, but also the way in which Daoist practice helps us better understand those scriptures. So that would obviously be movement specific. It might be text specific, whether it's relevant or not. Do we need some kind of root in practice to really understand certain texts, for example, meditation manuals, and so on. Developing a bilingual Daoist approach, including the possibility of reading, translating, interpreting original Chinese Daoist source texts. So here, it doesn't necessarily have to be translation. It can be thinking about the fact and exploring the fact that Taoism is an indigenous Chinese religion, and classical Chinese is really the language of Taoism, especially in terms of scriptures and ritual. So how do we engage Taoism in a bilingual manner, in a way in which we kind of understand the technical terminology, and especially the technical terminology in terms of context-specific meaning, but Taoist understanding of what that technical terminology means and how they interpret, how they apply it. So this includes the composition and publication of reliable scholarly and literary translations, including robust annotations. So this is obviously a lot of the work that I've done, working in Daoist literature, publishing Daoist translations. And then I'd say for this larger new Daoist studies, and maybe people who are embracing a Daoist study practice model, the aspirational possibility of Daoist translation. This is a phrase that I've coined. So Dao Jiao Fan Yi, that is Daoist translations, ideally done by Daoists who have this bilingual facility, doing explicitly Daoist translation with the intent of creating new Daoist texts that are connected to the original Chinese source text and provide a more reliable, more connected form of translation. So not just making new kind of material expressions or new scholarly productions, but really saying like we want to approximate the Chinese Daoist source text into other languages. So in this case, we're obviously talking about English. So the another part of this is the Daoist Translation Seminar that I mentioned, and also the Daoist Translation Committee. So these are two projects and ongoing, the Daoist Translation Committee, but also the Daoist Translation Seminar as the Daoist Studies Summer Seminar through the Daoist Foundation. These are events and undertakings that are intended to advance this. So to advance new Daoist studies, including the scholar-practitioner model, and also the possibility of Daoist translation. So the Daoist Translation Committee is currently working on a new complete annotated translation of the Bao Puzi Neipian, the inner chapters of Master Embracing Simplicity. And we're about 3/4 done with the translation. And then of course we still need to refine the annotations and hopefully eventually publish this book. So just kind of thinking about how this is emerging, where it's located, what are the different possibilities. I obviously invite you to think about it for yourselves. What's being done, what isn't being done, what needs to be done. So we can also think about tradition-based Daoist practice realization. And here I'm specifically thinking about books that at least have some connection to a study practice model. So this might be a little surprising to some of you if you know the history of Daoist studies, that I'm pulling certain books out by certain people, but I'll explain why. So here I'm talking about books that I think really are rooted in the tradition, that have some deeper understanding of the tradition and are trying to articulate that traditional view through the text in question. So the teachings of Daoist Master Zhuang, although this book's been disparaged, especially by Michel Strickmann's careerist hit piece, this book is fundamentally important. It's fundamentally important for understanding Taoism, the history of Daoist studies, but also as a kind of book to engage from a scholar-practitioner perspective. It was written by Michael Sassow, this important scholar of Taoism. He also, like Christopher Schipper, is an ordained Zhengyi Orthodox Unity priest. So Sassow and Schipper are Daoist scholar practitioners, but they don't really articulate a Daoist scholar practitioner perspective, meaning they're not explicitly saying we are Daoist scholar practitioners and we're trying to understand Taoism from a scholar practitioner perspective. That's really the approach that I've been trying to advance. And again, there's a lot of resistance to this. So there's a reason why in mainstream academia, one would potentially hide one's identity. There are career implications for letting people know that you're a scholar practitioner. But in any case, the teachings of Daoist Master Zhuang provide some kind of glimpse into contemporary Taiwanese Zhengyi Orthodox Unity Taoism, especially like from a lived perspective, as a kind of living community practicing ritual and so on. But Sassow also talks about some of the deeper, more esoteric, symbolic dimensions of Taoist ritual that overlaps with Taoist meditation. The Taoist Body, one of the most important books from my perspective, published in the history of Western Taoist studies, originally published in French in 1982, but then an English translation in 1993 by Christopher Schipper, a Dutch scholar, spent most of his career teaching in France, and then moved to China. So you can see he died relatively recently in 2021, also an ordained Zhengyi Orthodox Unity priest. And so in the Daoist Body, one thing that we find is, although Christopher Schipper is not saying, let me kind of help you understand Taoism from a lived Taoist perspective, from the perspective of a Taoist scholar practitioner, it is informed by that. The way he discusses Taoism, the different things that he emphasizes and privileges, I think is really Taoist informed. So this book, I think, gives us a flavor of Taoism. The Taoist Manual by Brock Silvers. Brock Silvers has at least some connection to the Longmen, the Dragon Gate lineage of Trinchen of Complete Perfection Taoism. And this book is important for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons it's important is it's actually trying to talk about Taoism as a lived and living tradition from a tradition-based perspective, thinking about Taoist practice, right? And so it's one of the first books to really speak as a Daoist about Taoism and Daoist identity. Some of the ideas in the book are problematic, right? It's not clear that this is really maybe the best way to understand Daoist identity and Daoist participation, but it gives people a flavor and an insight into the different dimensions of Daoist identity and Daoist practice. The Arts of Taoism, that's been published relatively recently by Xing De, a Longmen Daoist teacher, Dragon Gate Daoist teacher, located at Wudangshan, Mount Wudang, and Johann Hausen, one of his disciples, so also an ordained Longmen Dragon Gate priest. So how do these Daoists understand Daoist practice realization, again, from a living Daoist perspective, but rooted in contemporary mainland Chinese Taoism? Okay, so a very particular kind of location, but also a voice now about tradition-based Daoist practice realization. And then moving into my own work, Entering Stillness, A Guide to Daoist Practice, that I co-wrote with Kate Townsend, the co-director of the Daoist Foundation. So this is the primary Daoist manual used in the Daoist Foundation community. And then Handbooks for Daoist Practice, originally published in 2003, but we just released the 20th anniversary edition this year. So Entering Stillness is a kind of holistic and integrated discussion of Daoist practice realization from an applied, committed, and lived perspective. It's obviously our understanding and our experience of the tradition, but at least gives people a kind of accurate tradition-based approach and presentation. And then Handbooks for Daoist Practice overlaps what I was talking about earlier and what I'm about to go into, which is Daoist translation. So this is a translation series of 9 important practice-based and representative Daoist texts. So there are 9 texts that are translated in this series. In the 20th anniversary edition, it's now in 3 volumes. Volume 1 has handbooks 1 through 3, Volume 2 has 4 through 6, and Volume 3, 7 through 9. And this is the primary source book used in the Daoist Foundation community. And I've talked about this in some of the other Lundaos. There are different ways of understanding why these texts, why those texts are important, where they come from, and so on. So then we have this new Daoist translation series. I'm the editor-in-chief of it through the Daoist Translation Committee. So the Daoist Translation Committee, this is the current composition, right? We're working on the Baopuzi and Nepian, as I mentioned, the inner chapters of Master Embracing Simplicity, which to date only has one outdated and often problematic translation by James Ware, published in 1966. So it's a very difficult text, very complex. This is why it hasn't been retranslated, but it was necessary. So through a process of collaborative exchange and dialogue, this committee decided this would be the first title that we would work on. And as I said, we're about 3/4 of the way through. So maybe if all goes well, it will be published in 2024. That may be a little bit overly optimistic. But many of the people involved are scholar-practitioners, right? Daoists who are thinking about Taoism in terms of study and practice. Also people who are sympathetic to Taoism. So not all of the people involved are Daoists. But our aspiration is really to have this Daoist translation series informed by a Daoist study practice model. And as I said, to create Daoist translations. So once we shift and finish this project, there would potentially be additional members of the committee, maybe new members of the committee, but this is the current committee composition. So then if we think about this new Daoist studies and approaching Daoist literature, we want to be kind of thinking about Daoist literature as textual compositions written in classical Chinese with traditional Chinese characters using calligraphy. There are many genres of Daoist literature, including commentaries, discourses, hagiographies, poetry, precepts, records, scriptures, treatises, and so on. Scriptures, or Jing, is asterisk because this is the most important genre of Daoist literature. Jing, or scriptures, sacred texts, or classics, are the most important. All right. I prefer to translate Jing as scriptures because it shows you that they actually are sacred texts. They have some kind of canonical standing in the tradition. They're the most revered texts. So classics doesn't really cover it. It doesn't give you a sense that these are really religious texts, that they also have a certain kind of Daoists have a reverential engagement with them. They're technically one of the external three treasures, so I'll go into that in a moment. They're generally considered revealed and or inspired. They're usually anonymous. They're often associated with specific deities or mortals. For example, Lao Drun, Lord Lao, the deified Lao Tzu, Master Lao, also the personification of the Tao, and the early high god of organized Taoism. But what's interesting about reading Taoist literature from a Taoist perspective, and especially understanding Jing scriptures from a Taoist perspective, is a lot of times Taoists will talk about Jing as having ethereal additions. That is, there's a kind of ling, there's a numinosity to them, or particular kind of qi, energy infusing them. And also this talismanic connection. So the ethereal addition is somehow manifesting through the physical material expression as like a kind of human or quasi-human composition, and thinking about that relationship. So that is, they're not just material objects from a tradition-based Taoist perspective. There's also something infusing them. There's something that's manifesting through them. So the Jing are the second of the external three treasures, the Wai San Bao, the Tao, the scriptures, the Jing, and the teachers, the Shi, in that order. Okay, so this is oftentimes forgotten. The Tao is first, the scriptures are second, the teachers are third. So that means ideally the teachers should be connected to the Tao and informed by the scriptures, at least to a certain extent, right? Because the scriptures from this perspective are closer to the Tao. They're pure emanations of the Tao, right? Teachers can always be mistaken. Teachers can make certain kinds of claims that aren't actually rooted in the tradition or might not even have a certain kind of informed understanding. So the scriptures give us resources to kind of clarify the teachings, to have a deeper root in the tradition. And so thinking about scriptures, Jing, from a tradition-based Taoist perspective. Also, there are movement-specific textual corpuses, okay? So this is important because it's like which texts are emphasized by which Taoist and which Taoist communities. And so, of course, we would be located in a very particular way, emphasizing specific kinds of texts for a variety of reasons. But the most important Daoist textual collection is the Daozang, the Daoist Canon. Interestingly, the name literally means the storehouse of the Tao. So this again tells you something important about what this textual collection is from a tradition-based Taoist perspective, and further connects to the Jing, the scriptures, as the second of the external three treasures. The received Daoist canon actually comes from 1445 and 1607, right? But it has a very complicated history. So that history kind of begins, we can say, around 471, feeds into kind of early canons, early Daozangs, so 1713 to 1741, 1016. And again, this is a very complicated history. But the received collection was first compiled in 1445, obviously with a lot of other earlier materials, and then a supplement in 1607. So there are a lot of texts that have been lost. There are a lot of texts that were not collected. So the engagement with the Daozang is very complicated. The texts themselves have a very complex history. But when you think about Daoist literature from a tradition-based Daoist perspective, especially a contemporary Daoist perspective, it's really the Daozang as the Daoist canon. It's not the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, as the Taoist Bible. Yes, the Tao Te Ching is a centrally important Taoist scripture from a Taoist perspective. But it's not the most important scripture, or maybe it's only the most important scripture according to certain Taoists. It's obviously highly influential, but there's a huge amount of Taoist literature beyond the Tao Te Ching, and we can also locate the Tao Te Ching in the classical Taoist textual corpus. We can locate the Tao Te Ching in relationship to other texts as well, for example, how early Quanzhen and later Quanzhen complete perfection Taoists understand it. We also can talk about texts in circulation that are esoteric and texts in outer circulation that are exoteric. This comes from the Schipper and Varellen edited catalog of the Daozang, so the historical companion to the Daozang, which is this kind of cataloging of the received Daoist canon. And one of the reasons to put this here is to have us think about how are those texts located in the Daoist tradition? How have Taoists understood them? Who had access to them? So there are texts in inner circulation that, yes, a lot of them were compiled in the Daozang, but historically the average person would not have access to them. They're esoteric. And texts in outer circulation, so exoteric. So one thing that's interesting here is obviously the Tao Te Ching is an exoteric Taoist text. It's the Taoist scripture probably known the most to the general public, both in China, but also the larger global community, thinking about world literature and so on. But if we put that in context, in the later tradition, there's also the Shisheng Jing, the scripture on the Western Ascension. And that text presents itself as the esoteric companion to the Tao Te Ching. So the secret oral transmissions or teachings related to the Tao Te Ching. So that's, of course, again, complicated historically, but it's just to kind of show you the esoteric, exoteric dimension of the tradition and which texts would fall into which categories. All of these texts have major issues in terms of authorship, dating, and provenance. And the reason that Japanese Daoist Studies is here is Japanese Daoist Studies has tended to do the most detailed and sophisticated text critical work on Daoist literature. A lot of Western studies are indebted to Japanese Daoist Studies. Chinese Daoist Studies is also contributing a lot more recently to the kind of text critical engagement. But when we look at it historically, Japanese Daoist Studies is really known for this really high level kind of text critical work that clarifies a lot of these issues of authorship, dating, and provenance. So thinking about what I'm referring to as Daoist translation, Dao Jiao Fanyi. So again, this isn't just translating Daoist texts. This is an approach to translating Daoist literature and maybe especially Daoist scriptures that is really rooted in the tradition, right? That aspires to create a Daoist text in another language. And so from my perspective, it's Daoist infused. It may even be Daoist inspired, Daoist informed, and so on. So we're really trying to think through what makes something like Daoist translation different than just translation of Daoist text. As I said, from my perspective, it's rooted in a study practice model. It's really Daoist translations of Daoist literature by and for Daoists. So this is where I gave you the example of the handbooks for Daoist practice. That is the origin story of the handbooks for Daoist practice, and that kind of work continues on. So I'm not saying that Daoist translation can only be done by Daoists, right? Or that it's only for Daoists. What I'm trying to ask here and envision here is the possibility of a Daoist informed kind of translation. And that maybe Daoists, especially Daoists who have this language facility and these translation skills, can really make a unique contribution. And if you look at the primer for translating Daoist literature in some of my more recent work, one of the things I'm really emphasizing is this attentiveness to the technical terminology. So I just published a complete annotated translation of the Tao Te Ching. And one of the arguments I'm making there is that most translations of the Tao Te Ching are neglecting the contextual specific understanding of the technical terms that are really infused by contemplative practice and contemplative experience. So moving into a sample, if we're thinking about the kind of work that one might do, that we might do in thinking about Daoist translation, this is from my recently released complete translation of the Tao Te Ching. So one thing you can see in this is it's bilingual. It's asking the questions about the relationship between the primary Chinese Daoist source text and then the resultant English approximation translation. So this is an example, right? So the highest adeptness resembles water. Water is adept at benefiting the myriad beings because it does not contend with them. It resides in the places that people avoid, thus it is close to the Tao. In dwelling, be adept at groundedness. In centering, be adept at deepness. In giving, be adept at humaneness. In speaking, be adept at sincerity. In aligning, be adept at regulation. In doing, be adept in abilities. In moving, be adept at timeliness. Only one who does not contend is free from blame. So thinking about this in terms of new Daoist studies, in terms of Daoist translation, in terms of the possibility of a study practice model, there's a number of elements. One is trying to give an English translation that's more rooted in Daoist practice, that understands that this text is really about contemplative practice and contemplative experience. So working on Daoist translation, Daoist ways of reading, Daoist interpretations. So one thing you'll find here, if you look at the Dao De Jing book, is I talk about these lines, these aphorisms that begin with indwelling and end in moving as the 7 aptitudes, qi shan, and the relevance for practice, right? So a lot of times shan, so the first line is quite influential, written a lot in Chinese calligraphy, shang shang ruo shui. So oftentimes this is translated as the highest goodness or the highest skillfulness, the highest excellence resembles water. But in my translation, shan is actually a technical term related to aptitude. So the kind of things that Daoists are cultivating, the kinds of qualities that Daoists are expressing and realizing. So therefore, we can talk about those 7 aphorisms as the 7 aptitudes, the qi shan. So just looking at it, indwelling, be adept at groundedness. Okay, so if we're dwelling somewhere, if we're thinking about this kind of residential presence, we work on the ground. So this literally says ju shan di. So be connected to the earth. How is the earth related to your dwelling? Are you being attentive to the earth? And we can expand that out into literally the ground, the place, the residence of the place, and so on. So we can unpack this in various Daoist ways through a study practice model that deepens our practice and experience. And this relates therefore to the language, to the technical terminology, what sometimes I talk about as the contemplative lexicon, in this case of classical Taoism, but we can think about Taoism more generally, more broadly, as how in English are we going to approximate those technical specifics, right? And then looking at all of the different dimensions of this related to practice and experience. So as I mentioned, the complete annotated translation of the Dao De Jing was just published through Square Inch Press. The title is the Dao De Jing, a contextual, contemplative, and annotated bilingual translation. It obviously is bilingual. It has robust introductory chapters. It has comprehensive annotations, so interpretive notes, and then a lot of appendices to deepen study and practice. So if one looks at these more recent publications they've done, I think they really do articulate and approximate what I'm talking about here as new Daoist studies and even Daoist translation. So along these lines, we can think about types of Dao De Jing translations. There are 3 primary forms of translations, 3 primary types: historical, literary, and philosophical. You can see the vast majority are actually philosophical, and this list could just go on endlessly by people affiliated with the same group of people that have published this already and kind of doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, which begs the question of why. But to begin, historical is really thinking about attentiveness to the historical context. So we would say layers of the Dao De Jing are from the late Warring States period and also the early Western Han Dynasty. The reason the standard historical translation is usually D.C. Lau, but the reason it's asterisk is that from my perspective, these aren't fully historical because they don't give attention to the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. That is, to really contextualize the Dao De Jing is to be attentive to the larger context of classical Taoism and the classical Taoist textual corpus and a lot of the overlaps, which is what you'll see in my new book on the Dao De Jing. Literary is really trying to create more of a kind of accessible type of translation that approximates maybe the Chinese source text, but also kind of makes it more readable. It tends to be more like modern English, so maybe even polishing out a lot of the historical and religious references, and this is quite common, so then it reads more like English literature rather than the kind of classical Chinese source text that has a lot of religious content and kind of contemplative sensibilities and so on. Philosophical, as I said, from my perspective, are the most problematic, the most deficient. They neglect all kinds of aspects of the text. They're really about modern intellectual engagements and appropriations. I would even say domestications of the text. So that's not to disparage all of them. Some of them have like deep insight into the history of the text or certain kinds of redactions. So the Wagner trilogy of works on the Wang Bi commentary is giving us some kind of insight into that, into Xuanxue, into the profound learning movement, but not necessarily giving us access into the Tao Te Ching as a kind of contextual document of classical Taoism, or even the way that Taoists have understood the text, which is not philosophical, right? So it's not about disembodied ideas or intellectual rumination. And there's a reason that this is being done so often, right? Because it allows domestication, it allows the text to be appropriated, it allows it to be taught in academic context without having to confront the practice-based and the experiential elements of the text that might actually undermine so-called Western philosophy and so on. So the last one, which you can see, from my perspective, there are really only two scholarly translations related to emphasizing the practical. Michael Lafargue's The Tao of the Tao Te Ching, published in 1992, and then my own complete annotated translation that was just released. So Michael Lafargue's book is very important because he's one of the first people to really pay attention to the practice-based nature of the text, to think about the text as multivocal. He talks about saying collages, right? And reorganizing the text according to specific themes, including stillness and so on. But it's not fully successful because there isn't a deeper understanding of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. And part of the reason is because a lot of that scholarship was done after Lafargue published this book. So the book is pioneering. But then also that we need more attention to contemplative practice and contemplative experience, and especially what I explore in my own book, apophatic and quietistic meditation as the contemplative core. So this is emptiness and stillness-based practice. To this, we should also probably add popular translations, which aren't actually translations usually. They're usually versions or adaptations. That is, they're based on other translations. People usually don't know classical Chinese, or adaptations where they're actually just creating like a completely different expression of the text. So some of the more popular versions, not translations, because none of these people know Chinese, is Dyer, Le Guin, Mitchell, and Hoff. This is part of what I refer to as the Tao Te Ching translation industry, intentionally mistranslating and mispronouncing the title. So not the Tao Te Ching, which is even the pronunciation of the T, T, and C romanization, but the Tao Te Ching. So that is, you're not actually reading the Tao Te Ching in those texts, you're reading popular appropriations and misrepresentations of the text. So to kind of think about that, what's the relationship of the source text to the resultant translation, if it is a translation? And this is why we need a kind of bilingual translation. So just to say a couple other things about why I published this, right, this new book on the Tao Te Ching, is it's the first Daoist contemplative translation rooted in a Daoist scholar-practitioner approach, and also attentive to the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism, specifically the emphasis there on contemplative practice. So you can look, there's other Lundaos on the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism and the Tao Te Ching, but really to say, like, there's this question of, are people reading the Tao Te Ching? And if so, whose interpretations? Is that person reliable? What are the filters being used? So I mentioned Wang Bi and the Xuanxue. This is a distortion, I would say, of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching, in its context, is actually closer, from my perspective, to the He Sheng Gong, the Elder Dwelling by the River commentary, another influential Taoist commentary, but that's a topic for another day. So if you're interested in this, right, from my perspective, it's not simply being involved in Daoist studies, if we talk about new Daoist studies, it's also thinking about other things from a theoretical and informed perspective. So we study Taoism, yes. Maybe we translate Taoist literature, yes. What are the contexts of reception? What are the intellectual histories? So I've already shown you something about the kind of intellectual genealogy of mainstream kind of conventional sinological approaches to Taoism. Right? Most of them, especially in North America, and I would say even to a certain extent in Western Europe, are coming out of Michel Strickland's revisionist scholarship. And that was important, but it's also problematic and deficient in a lot of respects, especially as it's being kind of articulated in this kind of hegemonic approach in a modern context. What is the history of the translation of the Tao Te Ching? So this is this critical scholarly discussions of that. Who's translated the Tao Te Ching? How have they translated it? Why have they translated it this way? So if you're going to like read translations of the Tao Te Ching critically, think about them as cultural productions, different kinds of cultural influences and motivations, including what I mentioned as the Tao Te Ching translation industry. You might look at some of these kinds of publications. There are also some additional online resources. These are things that I've compiled. So the Daoist Studies Articles Online series, Daoist Studies Guide, Daoist Self-Study Guides, the supplements to the title index to Daoist collections, and these are on my alternate homepage. So you can access them there. They give you a lot of materials and resources for thinking about Daoist literature, thinking about Daoist studies, including this possibility of what we're talking about here as new Daoist studies, ways of doing it, certain kinds of topics, themes, issues, and so on. So to conclude, I'll just say there's an open invitation, right, to be involved in the Daoist Foundation, to be involved in the Center for Daoist Studies, that, as I mentioned, this is an emerging alternative Daoist community, including a scholarly community. Our aspiration is to have a future place-specific community, a center with an education, research, and translation center. So in this kind of vision, and we're working towards it now, we started to explore acquiring land. What we hope to do is have like a formal retreat center, which would be primarily about practice, but also about study. But that there would be a wing or a branch of it that would really focus on what we're talking about here, new Daoist studies. So formal education, research, and translation with the intent of generating like scholarship and translations rooted in new Daoist studies. So, Sabe, thanks for listening and take care.